A little while back, we processed our chickens that we raised on pasture, and so I have a lot of chicken carcasses. I like to cut up my chicken into pieces and freeze them that way. I only do a couple of them whole. So then I'm left with all these carcasses, and I usually make chicken broth. So today I'm going to be canning chicken broth. So just for anybody who's new to canning, I feel like it's important to just mention a few safety things. First of all, this recipe uses a pressure canner. So chicken broth is a low acid food, and when you're canning low acid foods, you need to use a steam pressure canner. The canner that I'm gonna be using today is an all-American canner. That's the other important point that I need to mention, is that you need to make adjustments for your altitude. So I really like this book for any additional safety things, questions that you have. I found this book at a Walmart like 8 years ago, and I recently saw that my local Walmart still has these. It has a really good guide for beginners. High acid foods, low acid foods, gives you some examples of those, and also has the adjustments for altitude if you're needing that. So the main thing for canning safety is just make sure that you are following a tested recipe. That is my number one thing. If a recipe has been tested for safety, you know that when you're finished, if you follow the recipe correctly, everything is safe. The recipe I'm using today comes from Ball, The Complete Book of Home Preserving. It is actually the recipe for chicken stock. I'm sorry, before I think I said chicken broth, but it's the stock recipe that I'm following today. They are different things, but I often use them interchangeably. The stock uses more of the bones, and that is what I'm using today. So I measure out 4 pounds of chicken parts and pieces. And if you have roasted up a chicken and you have a leftover chicken carcass, you can also use those too. So I've done this both with the raw chicken carcasses and with already cooked chicken carcasses where we've picked off all the meat and eaten that for a dinner. So I'm loading these up in crock pots. That is my preferred method for this, just because it's so hands-off for me. And then I am grabbing some celery. This is celery that I grew myself and that I blanched and froze, and it is about a cup worth. Next, I'm adding in some onions. My onions that I grew this year were a lot smaller. So the recipe calls for 2 medium onions, and I added in, I think it was 3 or 4 small ones. Then I add in 10 black peppercorns and 2 bay leaves. And I add in a tablespoon of salt. After that, I'm using sea salt. You can also use canning and pickling salt. The big thing is you just don't want to use a salt that has any additives to it. And the last step is I add in 16 cups of water. This is the equivalent of a gallon. And I forgot to mention before that when I make this, I always do 2 batches. So I do 1 batch in one crock pot and 1 in the other. And that is because when I do 2 batches, I can get a full canner load. Otherwise, you end up with about 3.5 to 4 quarts. And if I do 2 crock pots worth, I get a full 7 quarts. So I make sure I plug in my slow cookers and turn them on. I'm turning it on to low, and I cook them for anywhere between 12 to 24 hours, just depending on what's going on that day. You can also cook this on a stovetop instead of the slow cookers, and if you're doing that, just make sure you keep it on low, same thing. But the time would be a lot shorter. According to the recipe, it says about 2 hours or until the chicken is tender. So after it's all finished cooking, you want to strain out all of the solids I put it in a regular strainer first, and then I put it through a sieve that is lined with cheesecloth. This is just to make sure you get all of the particles out of there. You can see there's quite a few left even after straining once through a regular strainer. If you use the sieve and the cheesecloth, you get a lot more out. After that's done, I go ahead and put it in the refrigerator, and I usually do this for at least 24 hours. Sometimes I go a little bit longer. With this pasture-raised chicken, the fat doesn't solidify as well as the store-bought chicken. This is because pasture-raised chickens have less saturated fat, so it doesn't clump up in the same way that a store-bought chicken would. So it's a little bit more difficult to take out the fat, but you want to make sure you get all of that out of there. The next step is to warm up that chicken stock again to prepare it for going in the canner. I'm showing you right now me heating my jars. I heat them in my water bath canner. You can also use your dishwasher if it has a really good cleaning cycle. You no longer have to sterilize your jars before filling them with canned food as long as you're canning something longer than 10 minutes. And this is canned for 25 minutes for the quarts, so you don't have to sterilize, meaning you don't have to have your cans boil for 10 minutes before filling them up. You just want your jars hot and clean. And I use that water bath canner for that. So I'm showing you right now the pressure canner. This is inside my pressure canner, and you must use a pressure canner. As I mentioned before, I fill this with 2 to 3 inches of water, which is what my manual says. This is the All-American canner, so it's going to be different depending on what pressure canner you have. So I put I think it was about 3 inches in the bottom, and then I am filling the jars with the hot chicken stock liquid right now. And I just do this roughly at first. I'm not thinking about headspace too much, and then afterwards you can see I'm adding more because you want 1 inch of headspace at the top. And I apologize for my rudimentary tool there. I usually use the green tool, and mine at the time of filming this was in a box somewhere, so I just used my kid's protractor instead to measure. So right here I'm checking to make sure none of the jars have any nicks or cuts, because that can make it so your jars don't seal. And then I take vinegar and I put it on a clean cloth, and I wipe around all of the tops of the jars. You really just have to get the top edge, but I'm pretty thorough and get all the way around the sides. Then I take my jar lids and I place them on the top. It used to be that you had to warm up your jar lids before putting them on the jars. You no longer have to do that if you don't want to, but you do want to make sure that they're clean and rinsed off before use. Then I put on the rings around each of the jars, and you want to do this to fingertip tight. And what that means is you just use your fingertips to tighten the ring around each of the jars. And I try and do this as tight as my fingertips can do it, because especially in the pressure canner, all of the shaking in there will loosen things up. But of course, you don't want to use your fists, so it's too tight and then the jar lids buckle. So I use the jar lifter to put the jars in, and when you're putting them in, if you're new to pressure canning, this may look different. You don't need the water to cover your jars when you're steam pressure canning, because it is the steam pressure that is getting it to the temperature. So whether they're covered or not, doesn't matter. You just got to make sure you have the correct amount of water that your pressure canning manual says in the bottom of your pressure canner. On my pressure canner, I'm showing you I have to get the arrows to line up and everything to lock in. Then you want to take the wing nuts and flip them up above the top lid and tighten them. And you never tighten one at a time. You always want to tighten them both at the same time and opposite each other. So I do all of my canning outside because in the summer it's so hot. I like to keep my house cool. And so when we had our house built, we had this propane hookup put in outside, especially for canning. Next, you want to turn your heat source on high heat until a steady column of steam escapes from the vent pipe for 10 minutes before you put anything on that vent pipe. So I will set my timer for 10 minutes, and then after that 10-minute timer beeps, I go back and I add on my weighted gauge or pressure regulator weight on the top, and I'm canning at 15 pounds of pressure, so the 15 on that weighted gauge goes down, and that is where I'm canning at. I also have a dial gauge, which I love. I love having both. It makes me feel better about pressure canning because I can see when my weighted gauge is at 15 pounds of pressure, my dial will also read 15 pounds of pressure. Then you set the timer for 25 minutes once your pressure is reached. The big important thing is to never ever let the pressure go below where you need to be. So I'm at 15 pounds of pressure, should never go below that once your timer has started. They will tell you not to go above that either. But if you have to make an error, I would go a little bit above and not below. If you go below at any point during your canning, any point during that 25 minutes, you need to start over and can it again. Wait until you get up to however much pressure you need to be at and then start all over again. So if you need to make an error on this, if you can't get it to be steady at 15 pounds or whatever you need it to be, you can go a little bit up, but do not go under. So after your 25 minutes is up, you turn off the heat and wait until the pressure naturally returns to 0. You can see on my gut dial, it's all the way down at 0. This takes usually about an hour. And then you can take the weighted gauge off, or if you have a petcock, you can open that and vent the steam. And then I take the wing nuts and unscrew them. And then at this point, I usually wait a few minutes after I take the lid off. And then I take the jars out and let them cool on the counter. And you want to let the jars cool for at least 12 hours before you take the rings off the top. And you can always tell when you've done a good job pressure canning because it'll still be above the boiling point for a while on those jars. And then I label my jars. So I wrote chicken broth, but this is actually chicken stock. And once they're all labeled, you can put them in storage and use them later.